Yeah,
It would be like my dinner with them.
it would.
No, it would. And really the whole
Lot more
thing,
nervous breakdown.
remember Zoe's an actor, and the whole thing
Yeah.
has a kind of dramatic stage setup. Even when he's in the bathroom, and his mom is just like there in the bathroom talking to him, and he's just like being so mean to her. And but there's a curtain, right? The bath curtain that he draws back and forth. The bathroom is a dramatic space. It's set in very confined spaces in apartments, and it feels very much like it could be set on a stage, doesn't it? The theater is an important metaphor. Act, Zoe Glass, he says. So let's start at the beginning, though, and we'll get to the theatricality of it, for sure. Franny is a smart, attractive college girl on a date with her smart, attractive college boyfriend, Lane, to see the big game, the Harvard-Yale football game. They go out to lunch beforehand. Lane goes on and on about himself, his friends, his ideas, his classes, hoping to impress Franny with how smart and cool and attractive he is, and at one point he even offers her to read his English paper, which I categorically do not recommend as a way to impress your romantic interests. I am quite interested in your English papers. Your prom date, probably not. There's a time and a place for it, right? This is the time and the place. Franny just sees right through him because she is smart. Maybe a little too smart. And she is bored out of her mind on this date. But let's not be too hard on Lane. Lane really cares what Franny thinks about him, right? He reads and rereads the letter before she gets off the train. He has to sometimes hide in his voice the sort of affection that he has for her, because he has to appear like cool and disinterested as guys do. But he does actually care for her. Salinger, is pretty clear about that. And he's put some thought into this big weekend that he wants to spend with her, even if for self-interested reasons. He's even thought about like exactly how he can sneak into her room with the stairs where she's staying. So he's definitely put some thought into this, and he wants to impress her. The problem is, he wants to impress her not because she needs to be wowed, and she's like looking to be wowed, and this is going to be a great gift to her, although he thinks he is a gift to her, but because he needs to be the recipient of her wows, if that makes sense. He needs to feel impressive and desirable, preferably impressive and desirable to somebody who is also smart and young and attractive, somebody who dresses the right way, right? Who doesn't do that thing with her hair that like everybody's doing, so it's like not cool anymore, right? She has just the right raccoon fur coat, right? She's got that raccoon-lined coat that is angled over the back of her chair. And Salinger is like really quick to point out that who Lane really loves here in this scene is himself. Lane just loves himself, right? We should stop there and note that probably for most of us, loving yourself seems like a good thing, right? Do you agree? That sounds like a good thing. That sounds good to me.
Moderation.
In moderation, right? Yes, okay, good. So maybe there's a right way to love yourself, to esteem yourself, so that you can then love others. And there's a wrong way to love yourself, where like it just clouds your vision and you can't see the person in front of you. And what?
Narcissistic.
Narcissistic love. Oh yeah, that's a good word for it. Yeah, that's what the narcissist is. They'll even do something really, narcissists will do things that are self-destructive just to like get you to sort of, make them the center of the world again. If like
gaslighting and like.
Oh yeah.
All of that.
And if she's like gonna forget about me or he's gonna forget about me, I'll do something like crazy and then they'll have to come rescue me, and like that's the classic narcissist behavior. But so that's self-love gone wrong, and Lane is not sort of there yet. He's narcissistic, but he's better at hiding it than like I am. We're all narcissistic.
Like he's socially narcissistic. Like he almost wants to come across as narcissistic, but he still cares about her a lot individually, not just for his own good. So it's like this battle of narcissistic versus actually loving her.
I know. Yeah, he's so socially adept that his narcissism comes off as really charming.
Yeah.
That his narcissism takes the form of like, I'm going to plan this weekend for you. I'm going to have you meet all my friends. We're going to go to the game. I'm going to impress you with my paper. And so all those things are like very socially acceptable things. But he's kind of like secretly using them to nurture his wounded ego, because there's never enough space for the male ego. The male ego can always take up more space in the world. Yeah, thanks for knocking. And we fear anything that like is going to get in the way of I think it's true. Like most of us, like we get all these like harmful subliminal messages from advertising that say like you be more lovable. Like, even they don't say this out loud, right? The advertising. That's the subliminal message. You be more lovable if you looked a certain way, if you owned this new product, if you got a higher SAT score, like whatever they're trying to sell you. They do it by undermining your intrinsic self-worth, your sense of like I'm good. They like pick away at that, and you're like I would be better if I had this thing. So we all sort of like I think today. Have to do some work to love ourselves because everyone's trying to like tear that down a little bit, even if for not because they hate you because they just want you to buy their thing. Often loving yourself takes time, takes maturity, and you got to undo the subconscious damage of those messages. We understand the good sense of loving yourself, right? It's a precondition for loving other people because how are you supposed to receive love from somebody else unless you believe that like you deserve it, that you're like a lovable person. Deep down, really, really deeply, you got to believe it before you can let somebody else love you, and that's not easy. But in this case, I think we get that right. We all get that sense. It's sort of like a truism of pop psychology, right? You gotta love, like Oprah loves you, man, like just the way you are. And but for some people, that for many of us, I think that is an important battle to fight. All right, there's a different battle going on in Lane, and there's a different battle going on in this novel. It's the battle not to love the self, right? It's the battle against the self. It's the battle to get the self out of the way so that you can actually see the things in the clear light of day. It's the battle against the ego. I think the character of Lane makes this excruciatingly obvious to us. It's really, really hard to see another person clearly if you love yourself as much as Lane does. You just can't see the person. If you can't see him, you can't love him. And you just gotta love the way the narrator sort of patiently deconstructs Lane's self-satisfaction. Like one of his classmates walks in, and Lane just has that sense that he has just been seen by like an important classmate in the right place, right? The right restaurant. Not at Firestone, right? But at I don't know, where do you want to be seen? Novo, on the patio. And with like he calls it an unimpeachably right-looking girl, right? That's how Lane sees Franny. He's like, she's the right-looking girl for me to be seen with. And he's ordering the right food, right? He's not ordering a cheeseburger, he's ordering snails and frog legs, right? Escargot, like fancy French food. And it's really all about him and how he looks at Franny as a date. At one point when she's in the bathroom, Lane pulls out a cigarette, and the narrator tells us that he succeeds in looking, quote, attractively bored, right? Like, this is the kind of guy, he's like, imagine, even when he's there, he's like, how should I look bored in the most attractive way possible? That's a great dig. And, as long as I'm doing it fashionably or attractively, it doesn't matter if I'm bored or whatever. Franny, who we're told is a talented actress, right? So we started with that. That's important. Hold on to that. Franny is an actress who has had the lead role in several plays. She realizes that it's her job to look pretty, sitting across from Lane, and asking the right fawning questions like, oh, tell me more about your English paper, and to laugh at his jokes and agree with his taste in poetry and his taste in friends, and in general to sort of prop up Lane's ego and corroborate his sense of himself as more aesthetic, more sophisticated, more intellectually refined than everybody else, but also like more humble about it, because he doesn't outright like go say those things. He sort of sets it up and like fishes for her to say those things, and that's the game that they're playing. That's the game that women are often socialized to do this, right? To ingratiate themselves into men's egos, in part because as a woman, it's just safer to do this, right? Often you get ahead in the world if you do this, if you're good at acting the part. But Franny just can't do it anymore at this point. She thinks Lane is a babe, until he opens his mouth. But don't judge Franny too harshly for this. Like, so there's the temptation to be like, well, Franny's just faking it. She's just sort of like, why doesn't she just tell him what she really thinks? She's 20, right? Franny is 20 years old. It's confusing to be 20, right? Sometimes when you're 20, you date terrible people just because they look nice. And, hormones are an all-consuming fog, and that's how the human race perpetuates itself. If only, like, wise, good, saintly people got to reproduce, we would be facing extinction, right? Most of us, there's not enough of them out there, right? Most of us, normally selfish Lanes out there, we're selfish, but we're also just, like, beautiful enough to find a date to the football game. And that's sort of how like we get through life. Zooey kind of nails it, right, when he responds, maybe this is like a little bit of a crude response to Bessie, right? Bessie suggests, I'm just gonna start throwing out a bunch of page numbers, so you could mark in or run down or whatever. But Bessie suggests that Franny and Lane like really care for each other because Lane has called 3 times this morning, and Zooey says, that's just sex talking, buddy. He's a charm boy and a fake. And you get the sense that Zoe's probably right. Only Franny is still acting, right? She's still trying to fool herself into believing that Lane's a sweetheart, even though we can tell that she has no substantial interest in this guy on this particular afternoon at this lunch before this football game. And she breaks down, and she can't act the part anymore. And what's amazing is that when she's all recounting this to Zooey about this bad date, she actually gets mad at herself for ruining Lane's afternoon, right? When she's telling the story about the football game, she's like, oh, I was such a horrible, and she's right, she was kind of horrible to him, but she doesn't sort of assign any blame to Lane, but that's kind of interesting. I'll say, yeah, go ahead. That's 90, when she says, I was so horrible picking away at him. I don't have the page for that one, but that's early, it's probably in the 60s. It's fairly early in the, probably in the 70s or 80s. Fairly early in their dialogue. I will say, as an aside, that I did actually get out of the library once and go to the big Harvard-Yale football game. It switches off every year between New Haven and Cambridge, and that's where they are. That's where they're trying to go. My only advice about the Yale-Harvard football game is not to go into the game itself. It's go for the tailgating, right? Don't go for the football. Both teams are just like excruciatingly bad at football. There's like high school football teams in Texas that could just like beat the snot out of Yale. But if you, yeah, no, they're not there for their like, yeah. But if you cruise the parking lot, you will find like dudes in tweed blazers and like women in pearl necklaces with like fully catered tailgating spreads. Like their tailgating spreads, they've got, usually you show up to tailgate and you bring like a couple of sausages in your grill and some beers and stuff, and then they've got like, yeah, sushi, yes, no kidding, like artisanal fancy cocktails and stuff. And if you're wearing the same color hat that they're wearing for that team, then they'll feed you, no matter who you are, because they have all this food, and they're trying to be magnanimous and give you fancy cocktails.
So just bring both hats.
Yeah, bring both. Yeah, just a change of clothes. An H hat and a Y hat. Yep. And pretty soon, like, you don't really care who wins or loses the game because you're having a great time with all these lovely people tailgating. I made it into about 3 minutes of the game when I went. But it's also like there are more people literally in the parking lot than in the stands. Okay, anyway, so that's the game. What is Franny's breakdown about? Well, what is the complaint that she wishes to lodge against the world? So maybe, I don't know, if you guys want to give a crack at that, it's sort of hard to say at first, but what do you think? Like, what is her problem? Why is she having this breakdown? Why is she having this crisis? What's her major issue with the way the world is set up? That sort of comes to the fore here in this little novella. And there's no wrong answer to this, right? Just some of your impressions. Like, what's Franny? What's eating Franny? What's eating at her? She's not eating her chicken sandwich. Why isn't she eating her goddamn chicken sandwich? They use that word like punctuation. It's like more common than commas. It doesn't have to be like, oh, here's the fine language. It's like, what are your impressions? Like, what bothers her about the world?
Something she says is, I'm so horribly conditioned to accept everybody else's values, and just because I like applause and people to rave about me doesn't make it right. I'm ashamed of it. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of not having the courage to be an absolute nobody.
Great. What page is that on, Grace? 26. I'm sick of not having the courage to be an absolute nobody. I'm sick of it all. Ego, ego, ego. Let's just say, is that page? Oh, yes. And on 26, do we have different pages? Do I have different pages than you? Oh, that's a bummer. Oh, no. That's because that's not on my page 26. That's a different one.
But
How do
the
you?
ego is on our page 26.
What?
The ego that you were talking about is on our page 26 too. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
I
at
don't
the
know.
top of ours.
Because I remember
Yeah,
where Grace.
literally
Okay,
just
so
it.
that's my 29. So I'm a couple pages behind you. Oh darn it. Okay, that's a bummer. One of the things that Salinger was really famous for, all of his books look exactly the same because he had the same publisher and he wouldn't let anybody reprint things or change anything. So I thought we would all have the exact same page numbers because he's like notoriously, all of his books are just really plain and. Okay. Oh well. That's so. If you go back a couple of pages to page 20, my page 26, so probably your page 23 and 24, there's a big paragraph that says, all right, Franny said wearily, France.
Oh yeah, that's page 22.
Good, page 22. Okay, so I'm like a couple of pages, I think.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so go back to page 22, and in the middle of that paragraph, right, she says, she's talking about his friend Wally, and she's like, Wally could just be any one of your friends who they're all the same, they're all interchangeable. Sorry if I don't remember his name. And she says it's everybody. So the middle of that paragraph, she says it's everybody. I mean, everything everybody does is so, I don't know, not wrong. So this is her complaint, right? It's not wrong or even mean or even stupid necessarily, because Wally is smart. These guys go to Yale. They're not wrong. They're not stupid. But just so tiny. This is part of her complaint. So tiny and meaningless and sad making. And the worst part is, if you go bohemian or something, right? If you get all countercultural and drop out and rebel, or something crazy like that, you're just conforming as much as everybody else, only in a different way. So she's got this sense, and I think it's at first, what I'm trying to say is at first, Franny's crisis looks a lot like ordinary teenage angst, right? It looks like, oh, the world is phony and conformist, and I just take what Grace, the passage that Grace read, I just feel like I have to take in everybody else's values, and I'm sick of not having the courage to go my own way. But then the problem is, if I go my own way, then I'm rebelling just like everybody else. So what's the way out, right? So now, what's great about this is that part of Salinger's art is that he's going to deepen our sense of Franny's crisis little by little. I think in the Franny section, you could sort of be excused for thinking that her crisis is sort of she's with this guy that she doesn't like and she doesn't really have the guts to be a nobody and break up with him. But as Salinger starts adding to it, your reader comes away understanding there's something much, much bigger going on here. The kind of thing you can't just come out and talk about straight up. So on page 26 there, when everything's sad making, or that your page 22, then your page 26, where she talks about ego and the courage to be nobody, so let's just get this out there. Let's just put it on the table so we all can agree with this and just sort of see it, mark it, and this, just understand that this is not exactly the thing that's eating at Franny. Does everybody agree? Right? The world is petty, right? It is small. It is sad-making. It is materialistic, right? It is full of ego. Everybody walking around. It's just, Lane's ego happens to be wearing white shoes and discussing Flaubert, and, Cal Poly guys are shirtless, running past with their, lacrosse sticks or whatever. It's the same thing, right? It's still, and what?
Tiny running shorts.
Tiny running shorts, yes. And on one hand, you're great, nobody will ever look this good again. You should just have fun and own it. And I think there's a difference between that and sort of thinking everyone's looking at me when I do this versus this is awesome, I'm doing this. And even things that are that's sports or whatever, but things that are we understand that ego is an important part of sports, right? You're not a good athlete unless you believe that you're the best, right? You have to go out there and feel I'm going to dominate this, or else you're done. Right? You don't have any chance of dominating unless you feel that. That's one of the reasons I'm such a terrible athlete. I'm out there and I'm oh wow, that was a really good pitch, man. Just
no.
froze me on the outside corner. Good job. And my team is what are you doing? Did you see that? That was
me for soccer when I was younger. I would run next to my teammates, cheering them on.
Yes! I know, the soccer coach at the girls' school that I used to teach at, which is all the school that Franny went to, she would get so mad at them. She was you guys are too nice. Stop, like, throw an elbow, right? Stop being nice. Yeah. But that's sports. There's some ego that is important to succeeding in sports. Ego is not always a bad thing, right? Ego is not always useless. It's got its place in life. Plato is going to argue for this in the Republic. He's going to call it thumos in a way, which is not exactly the same as Freudian ego, but it's something that every successful professional that I've ever met in business and sports and whatever all has this thing, thumos. We'll read about it. It's like the good version of this next year. But I think but the problem is, I think, for Franny, that even things that are supposed to be pure, like this, right? Like poetry, like literature, like knowledge, like love, mainly we pursue them because of how they make us look, right? How they make us feel. I feel like I would look good at Yale, so I'm gonna get these SAT scores, and I'm gonna wear the blazer, and I'm gonna, this would look good on me, right? You're not actually pursuing knowledge for a pure sense. You're pursuing it because it confers some status on your ego. I think we all get that, right? We all do that. Even the poets, Franny says, who are supposed to make things more beautiful, get caught up in book sales and prestige and who's publishing how many poems, and they're not actually leaving behind anything that's beautiful in the world. She says, this is great. This must be on your page 15 or so, because it's on my page 19. She says, I guess I should read it. She says, if you're a poet, you're supposed to do something beautiful. You're supposed to leave something beautiful after you get off the page. And the ones you're talking about, these poets that he admires who are publishing in the Yale Review and all the right poetry journals, and it's
17.
Page 17, okay. She says the ones you're talking about, they don't leave a single solitary thing that's beautiful, and all that may be slightly better, all of the maybe slightly better ones do is get inside your head and leave something there just because they do, just because they know how to leave something there. It doesn't have to be a poem, for heaven's sake. It may just be some kind of terribly fascinating syntaxy droppings. Excuse the expression, right? Droppings is poop, right? She says that's what even the best poets are doing. They're not actually making the world a more beautiful place. They're just leaving behind some poopy residue in your head, syntaxy droppings. Syntax is like word order, right? And that's the best that these so-called poets can do. They don't make their lives beautiful. They don't make their communities more beautiful. They don't make their families more beautiful. Often poets are terrible to their families. People sacrifice all kinds of things in the name of art and become horrible egomaniacs to those around them. But they create these beautiful things that leave beautiful things. Franny doesn't think they're that great. That just leave syntaxy droppings in your head. And then, you can quote John Keats. But what was Keats' life like? Did he beautify his work? That's what a poet is, right? So she kind of agrees with Rilke, that the poet is not necessarily the one who writes the poems. And then what does that make the poet is the one who makes the world beautiful, right? That's what Rilke says. But what does that make the literary critics? I guess we're the ones who pick through the poop and try to see, make arguments about what this creature was eating by looking at their syntaxy droppings or something, right? So,
which in a way is still feeding the ego, because it's
look what I found.
Yeah.
I found this argument that proves that Salinger really meant this in the book, yeah. And she said, now, that's the bad thing, right? We get that there's ego involved in life, but Franny is upset that even these things that are supposed to be pure, like religion, like literature, like love, are just shot through with ego through and through. And there's just, what you have is fascinating crap. So as a reader, you're kind of drawn to Franny initially because we resonate with her sense that the world is stupid and full of phonies. And even if you try to get outside of what the world counts as success, you're just rebelling, which is just another way of conforming. And Franny sees all that. There seems to be no outside of it, right? So this is one way to state the main dilemma of the novel. That Franny needs to learn to live within the world, but not become of the world, right? That is a very difficult thing to do. Franny doesn't think that you can do it by dropping out, getting outside of the world. She thinks you got to live within it, but you can't be of it. Now, how do you do that? That's going to be the burden of the novel. Okay, here we sort of get to see something of the genius of J.D. Salinger. There's a literary critic, he teaches at Harvard. His name's Louis Menand. And he says that Salinger's first novel, The Catcher in the Rye, I think I told you about The Catcher in the Rye, didn't I? The first novel. And Menand claims that it invented, this is a huge claim, isn't it? He says Salinger invented American adolescence. That's a big claim. And the narrator, I think I told you, he's 14 years old, and And Salinger says, Manon says in one of his pieces on Catcher in the Rye, he says, the whole emotional, tell me if you agree with this, I don't know. He says, the whole emotional burden of adolescence is that you don't know why you're unhappy or angry or out of it. You just are, right? You don't know why, and you are, and that's what it is to be a teenager. And Catcher in the Rye, Salinger gives us like this perfect language to tell you like why you're unhappy. And Franny's got some of that too. And she's going to say like, here's why all of this is BS. And I think this is like a totally, so you got to walk away with this after you've read Salinger. And know his place in literary history, right? This is a totally new thing that Salinger has stumbled upon. You guys have read books from the Victorian age. There are no like hyper-articulate adolescents with a language for expressing their dissatisfaction with the adult world, which we all know is full of crap. But there's this sense in the Victorian age that we must not say so, right? And that whole side of experience of being like a young person and being like, nothing feels good, and I don't want to be like them, and that's like an important like part of. There's a whole goddamn industry built on it, right? YA literature, right? But in the this didn't happen before Salinger, right? Before modernism, this was a taboo to talk about this, and you had to like not talk about how things were, your sense of dissatisfaction with the world. So we wouldn't know how to begin to talk about it, and there's no language for it. And Salinger comes along, and he's like, hold my beer. Like, I will give you the words for this. In Franny and Zooey, however, this is why we're reading Franny and Zooey, not Catcher in the Rye, even though Catcher in the Rye is like this like landmark literary thing. I don't think it's actually that helpful to read if you're trying to become wise. Why? Because Salinger in Franny and Zooey is going to go beyond where he's at in Catcher in the Rye. And he's going to give us not only the way to express our dissatisfaction with the so-called real world, but also a way to get beyond our dissatisfaction with the real world. And he's going to say, in fact, when you're an adolescent, you think it's profound to be dissatisfied with the world. And you're right. But what's even more profound than being dissatisfied and disillusioned is becoming disillusioned with your disillusionment. And that's why Catcher in the Rye, even though it's a landmark novel, doesn't really get us to the place that we need to get, which is where Franny and Zooey gets us. Salinger in Franny and Zooey wants to show us how to love the adult world again. Not in spite of the fact that it's stupid and crazy-making and full of ego and the rest, all that is true, Holden Caulfield is right, but maybe even because of it. So that's going to be what he's going to try to teach you in this novel is, we all, I think just growing up, we know how to be disillusioned. That's not a like great feat for us. Right? You're 15, you're disillusioned. What does Zooey say? He says, it's Caligula. It's the goddamn Iron Age. Anybody over 16 without an ulcer is a goddamn spy, he says at one point, right? Like, you're not paying attention if you're not dissatisfied. But also, don't stop there. That's what Franny and Zooey's going to do. Basically, Zooey is going to tell Franny that any 10th-rate pseudo-intellectual can become a cynic and disillusioned and pissed at the world. But it takes a first-rate intellect, maybe even a great soul, maybe even a saint, to see the world in all its ugliness and love it anyway, and something intrinsically holy. It takes a true spiritual genius to do that, so he argues, not just like a clever Holden Caulfield. It takes somebody with God consciousness, he says. It takes somebody... What?
Where is this? Is that...
Let me give you a page. Well, actually, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, right? When he says, that's the last 3 pages of the novel where he says, Christ is a spiritual genius. Where is that? These are the last 3 pages. Oh no. Okay. I might be. I have got all the page numbers written down here. I might be getting ahead of myself. But just realize, right, that this is a really, really valuable thing that you can take away from this novel, is to understand that how the world is just a hot mess and and it's run by lanes, and you got to deal with those people. And guess what? Like, you are also a hot mess of like ego, just as Lane is. And you still got to love yourself anyway. You still got to love the world anyway. And you got to shine your shoes. You got to shine your goddamn shoes for the fat lady every single day. That's the last 3 pages. Let's just end the Franny section here. Then I'll give you a bunch of page numbers for that. For now, the Franny section ends with Franny passing out at the restaurant after chain-smoking cigarettes and not touching her chicken sandwich, right? Cigarettes are like, they're spiritual, they're like air, they're going up. There's nothing that keeps it down. The chicken sandwich, the food, is embodied, it's grounded, and that's what she doesn't have. She's being too spiritual. She's trying to be more spiritual than God, right? God is in the chicken sandwich, right? God is in the consecrated chicken soup, not in the cigarettes that they're smoking. And she's sweating up a storm, and she's trying to like be nice to this fake charm boy sitting across from her who's going on and on about literature and football statistics while eating his fashionable snails and frog legs. And now, okay, in the Zooey section, this is where we start to get the sense that Franny's in fact having a full-blown existential crisis cloaked as a nervous breakdown. And there is a difference. There is a huge difference between an existential crisis and a nervous breakdown, or just normal teen angst. And we got to clarify what that difference is in a moment. And we have to learn that is in fact the same existential crisis that has sent her scurrying back home. Right? So the second section opens, and Franny is with her parents in an apartment in the city where she can sleep on the couch until mid-afternoon. Right? This is like what you do when you come home from college. And you've got your cat, Bloomberg, the cat, and you can get a break from all these phonies like Lane and Professor Tupper, and she can be like lovingly pestered by her older brother Zooey and her well-intentioned, long-suffering mother, Bessie, who keeps trying to soothe Franny by feeding her cups of consecrated chicken soup. It's an important symbol. And Bessie, Bessie, the mother, you feel for the mother, right? She just like wants her children to get married and like lead normal lives. And she wonders, what good does it do you to be so smart and to see through all this stuff if it doesn't make you happy? And that's when Zooey says, anybody over 16 without an ulcer is a goddamn spy. That's page 140 in my book, I guess. So maybe a few pages earlier, in yours, maybe 135. It's like that cliche saying, right? If you're not upset, you're not paying attention. And Salinger is sympathetic to that point of view to an extent, but he's like, you're not wrong to think that the world's a hot mess of meaninglessness, but he also knows that kind of cynicism can become its own self-confirming trap, and unfortunately, the only way out of that cynicism is through it, which is why he just bombards you with it, right? Which is why this novel feels so exhausting to read in some ways, that Salinger has to sort of march us through all this despair to whatever is on the other side. Peace, rest, enlightenment, sleep, right? It ends with Franny falling asleep. A deep sleep in her parents' bed, surrounded by freshly painted walls. Okay, but we're not there yet. I keep getting ahead of myself. Okay, one more key detail to learn in the Franny section is this. Franny's crisis has been precipitated by a little green cloth-bound book. What is this book, right? I just think I waved it at you the other day. It's this. It's called The Way of the Pilgrim, or The Pilgrim Continues on His Way. It's actually both books in one volume. Has anybody heard of it before? Did I ask? Has anybody encountered it? Yeah, I would be really surprised if you did. Just think about how many of you, probably in this room, I'm not asking whether you're like actively in it now, but how many were raised, you don't have to raise your hand, but how many were raised with some sort of Christian background and have never heard of this book, right? That's probably about right. Just as a sort of an outside observer, one of the very peculiar things about American Christianity is that it tends to assume that Christianity started in the 1950s. In America, of course, which it most certainly did not. There's this whole vast literature, this is it, of prayer and the spiritual life, and the historical church for thousands of years has been painstakingly building up and transmitting and safeguarding this ancient wisdom, where some really thoughtful people put a ton of time and care into developing the sense of like how you should pray, right? Don't just like close your eyes and start talking to yourself, and feel like vaguely spiritually and holy, right? There's a whole art and a whole science to prayer, and it's been worked out by a lot of people over time, and that's what The Way of the Pilgrim is. It's a small piece from this vast literature on mystical prayer that is like very unfamiliar to even people who have been inside this thing for a long time. And Franny and Zooey, they call themselves freaks, right? Part of he says we're all freakish. Seymour and Buddy turned us into freaks by giving us all these books, all this really intense stuff that nobody else understands, but is very meaningful to us. And reading sometimes does that to you. Reading makes you weird. Flannery O'Connor said that. She said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will make you odd." And so we'll talk about what way they're freaks here in a second. But that book is part of it. This book is trying to teach a kind of prayer that awakens the soul and transforms it by basically taking Lane, the sort of walking, talking ego, and deconstructing that, right? Deconstructing the ego, the false self, because the false self has to die. The false self must die if you're ever going to truly live. That's sort of the claim that the book is making. That's what Franny's after in the novel. But the problem is, right, deconstructing the self is really, really hard because you and I, at least I, have so much invested in myself and my own advancement in the world and people loving me and all that. We love ourselves. Maybe we don't love ourselves like as obviously as Lane does and like grotesquely as Lane does, but we all do. And what the way the Pilgrim teaches is that the religious life is not just sort of like gaining more accolades and more treasure and like a pious ego or something like that. It teaches that the religious life is one non-stop fun adventure of dying to yourself. And it's not the fulfillment of the ego, the religious life, it's the devastation of the ego and all the things that you think like make you important and interesting and special. Those are the things that are preventing you from seeing and loving the world. And, you know, Elaine is sort of like, well, if I pray, then I can be like cool and self-important and get A's on my English paper, which he really wants. But the way the Pilgrim is going to say, right, your true self is not found in these worldly achievements. Rather, your true self is hidden away somewhere, and you got to find it by dying to this false self. And then only then do you get to encounter reality in its fullness. So death is sort of at the heart of the religious life, truly, and that's what the Pilgrim book is supposed to teach. How does this prayer work? So look on 36, right? Or my page is 36. For you, it's probably 34, 32. It's like a long passage where she explains the way the Pilgrim, and she says, he's been studying this book called the Philokalia. You guys, so what, it's a long paragraph, maybe 32 or something, where she talks about this, the Philokalia. That's this book, the Philokalia. There's one volume, there's 4 volumes of it. You guys know what philosophia is, right? What is philo is love. It's what?
31.
It's 31, page 31.
I think it starts from 31.
Philosophia is love of Sophia. What's Sophia?
Wisdom.
Philokalia. What is kalos in Greek?
What is called?
Yeah, this is going to be important for Plato. Is it really kalos as a Pokemon?
Yes.
Oh, man.
Yeah, Pokemon, yeah.
The love of Pokemon. I looked into it. Gotta catch them all. Gotta pray them all. Gotta read them all. No, so this is what this is, the Philokalia. Now, so this is love of beauty, right? And this is sort of the great sort of Eastern text about prayer, right? If you want to know how to pray, like, don't just listen to somebody who stands up there talking, right? Like, you have to enter into deep silence and into the Jesus prayer, into the devastation of the ego and all this stuff. And it's like, okay, I just want to be seen as like cool and pious and holy, like, and it's like, no, that's propping up your ego. This will devastate your ego. And it begins with beauty, right? The love of beauty is sort of the claim. So she explains the prayer, and then at the bottom of that paragraph, so I guess Grant says this is on 31, she says you just have to do it with your lips at first, and then eventually something happens. The prayer becomes, it's the prayer, so it's the word for this in Greek is hesychasm. It means praying without ceasing, right? And how do you do that? Because you got things to do in your life, right? You got to drive to the grocery store, you got to like write your English paper, you got to go to basketball practice. How do you pray while you're doing all those things? Well, this is sort of this spiritual technology for doing it. You repeat the prayer over and over and over and over again on your lips. And eventually the prayer gets into your mind. And so you're always sort of thinking about it. And you're always like sort of calling on the name of Jesus. And then the prayer goes from your mind into your heart. And it's that descent from the mind into the heart, without canceling the mind. They're careful to say that is what holiness is, right? When this prayer moves from your lips to your mind to your heart. And she says something happens. The prayer becomes self-active. Something happens after a while. I don't know what. Is this all like totally foreign to you? Like nobody's ever... This is like for thousands of years. This is like how people pray. And then all of a sudden we're like, wait, let's forget about all that. But she says, eventually something happens, the prayer becomes self-active, something happens after a while, I don't know what, but something happens and the words get synchronized with your heartbeats, then you're praying without ceasing, which has a tremendous mystical effect, so this is an important passage, which has a tremendous mystical effect on your whole outlook. I mean that's the whole point of it, more or less. I mean, you do it to purify your whole outlook and get an absolutely new conception of what everything's about. So maybe put a check mark next to that. why do you do this? You do it to purify your outlook and be able to see everything and know what it's about. You get a whole new conception of what things are about. Once the prayer kills and scours and gets rid of your false self and your ego and all your sense of like self-importance, then you can see the world clearly. Then you have a new sense of what it's all about. And you understand the holiness of the chicken sandwich that's in front of you. And you understand this poor lost boy Lane just wants to be loved, right? And then you don't... I had a professor, Amy Hungerford. You can look up her lecture. She teaches at Yale. You can look up her lecture on Franny and Zooey from 2009. You can listen to her whole lecture. It's not good. It's terrible. And one of the things that's bad about it is that she rips into Lane. And she's like, oh man, it's like, oh, like, as somebody who like more than a little bit resembles Lane or has resembled Lane at various points in my life, the point of Franny and Zooey is not to rip into Lane, it's to love him. It's to learn how to see his sniveling little needy ego operating in all these things and just say like, oh, like, buddy, like, it's okay, like, you don't need to, right? And she just tears into him and you're like, you've never been like a stupid college boy, Amy Hungerford, because you were always Amy Hungerford, like professor of English at Yale. But Franny would hate her, right? Franny would say she's just another one of these.
Doesn't realize it. Yeah.
What?
She is Wayne and doesn't realize it.
Yeah, maybe. Oh, totally. Yeah, I don't know how academics write on this book without, it just totally.
Without feeling slight guilt inside.
Exactly. Yeah. But she
Yeah.
does, and it's like the point is to feel tenderness for other people's and the world's stupidity and its meanness and pettiness and ego, not to reject it, right? Or maybe you got to reject it at first, but anyway, sorry, Amy Hungerford. She's way smarter than me. She has forgotten more about modernist literature than I will ever know. I will just put that out there. But she gets it wrong because she doesn't know how to sympathize with this weak college boy because she was never a weak college boy herself, maybe. So that's...
Maybe.
Maybe it's a past life. Salinger's all about the reincarnation. So the point is that... Here's the point. The point is that Franny has found one of these books. She's found one of these books that talks about something real and true and beautiful. And whenever you find something real and true and beautiful, it's at once a great blessing, but it's also a problem. Why? Because it reorients your conception, as Franny says, of, quote, what everything's about. And now, you can't just find a beautiful thing and everything else is the same. Right? You find a beautiful thing and everything else changes, gets transfigured in its light. And some things become brighter and some things become dimmer. And that can be a problem, right? Because once you start to love the truth, you start to hate what is false. And that's what you got to get past if you want to really be like, an enlightened person. It doesn't take an enlightened person to realize that the world is false and fake, and you should hate it, right? You should. There's lots of things to hate in the world. It takes an enlightened person to be like, I love the truth, the world is false and fake, but I'm gonna love it anyway, because real love cannot be contaminated. Like human beings, you guys know this, we're always afraid that our love is gonna be contaminated if we love the wrong person, right? Or if we love the wrong things or whatever. And the truth about love, and you're just mistaking love for desire, right? You desire the wrong things, and that leads to restlessness and hunger and breakdowns and all that. But love leads only to more love, right? You know this. And the difference, it's hard, but you got to get over a bunch of illusions about yourself and about the world before you can tell the difference between love and desire. Desire without constraints will lead you to emptiness and meaninglessness, but love leads only to more love. That's the idea. That's the problem. She finds this thing that's beautiful, and she sees that everything else in the world now is empty, and she's not wrong, but she's wrong, right? She's not wrong that everything in the world is empty, but she is using that as an excuse to not love it. But that happens, right? When you find a new book, or a new movie, or you meet a new person, right? The rest of the world, just your old friends, whatever, looks kind of dull in comparison, and you get frustrated. You get frustrated with these ordinary things, like math homework, and they lose some loveliness for you. Some people, they feel like they've encountered God in their life, and this happens. They found a higher object, and then they reject a bunch of other stuff they used to love as lower. This is such a silly story, but I think it helps. When I was in 8th grade, the currency of coolness was CDs. The more CDs, because this is the only way you could listen to music. And they're really expensive. CDs are $18, and so if you got a bunch of CDs, you're cool. And my friend Ryan Masterson went to this evangelical church when he's in 8th grade. that convinced him, and keep in mind, he's 13 years old, right? He is not like a fully formed thinking person. He's 13 years old. They convinced him to throw away all of his CDs that weren't glorifying to God. And you know, he did. He threw them all away. And of course, you know, their definition of what's glorifying to God is like irrationally, undefensibly narrow, right? It's like only specific praise music or something is glorifying to God, and like the human excellence of like Mozart and like just playing music. Like playing music is not glorifying to God. Only like this kind of music is. That's like how ISIS is really, or the Taliban are coming back into Al-Qaeda. I was listening to an interview with a female pianist, and she's like, I don't know what's gonna happen to me. I'm a woman. Taliban hate women. I'm a pianist. The Taliban hate music, right? They think this is not glorifying. So, you know, it's like in heaven they only listen to K-Love, right? But not Mozart. They don't listen to Mozart. It's like, I don't know why he threw all these CDs away. A few years later, Ryan had to buy all these CDs back one by one, and he wasted hundreds of dollars doing it. But you get the point, right? Franny wants to throw out everything in her life and just say the Jesus prayer. Just do the thing that's glorifying God, because nothing else is worthwhile in comparison. And she's not wrong, right? Like, get rid of all that. There's a bunch of crap in our lives that isn't, like, you know, helpful, and maybe you should get rid of it. But she's not going about it rightly, and that's Zoe's complaint with her. So that's the idea, right? While falling in love can be wonderful, falling in love also has this shadow side to it, right? Because when you love something true, you hate what is false. And you have to sort of do that, but then you have to get over that, and you have to realize, I've got to love these false people need my love way more, right? You know, the Pope doesn't need your love, right? Lane needs your love. And the right kind of love, not the love that's going to prop up his ego, but the love that's going to devastate his ego and bring him into reality. This is not just the teen angst of like, oh, the world is so phony and people are conceited and narcissistic and materialistic. That's true, but there's something else to this, right? Some things in the world really are realer than others, right? Art, truth, love. These things are realer than power, money, success. And Salinger he just wants to add to this list of real things the experience of God. So that's part of what the Jesus prayer is trying to get you. We can remain agnostic here in this class about the existence of God. Who knows about that? But certainly the experience of God is real in lots of people's lives, and it changes them, and it changes what they value, sometimes for the better, because then you start to embrace things and love things, and sometimes for the worse, because you start to exclude things and draw those lines. And that's exactly what Franny is saying. You know, Jesus is a genius at not doing. Jesus doesn't draw those lines, and she's going to show you how. But, you know, you find something else that you love, and it becomes hard to see the point of like getting an A in English class or impressing your Ivy League buddies or whatever Lane's life is organizing around. You don't care anymore about who's dating whom and all that stuff. Really, once you've encountered some object of ultimate concern, right? That's how, there's an existentialist theologian named Paul Tillich who taught at Yale for a bunch of years. He says that's his definition of God. He says what God is whatever your object of ultimate concern is. Any sort of ultimate concern you have puts all these like daily concerns in the shade, and it puts all that's false in the shade, and he says that's what you got to get over. You got to realize that this object of ultimate concern is going to make you more concerned about the person in front of you, the chicken soup in front of you, not less concerned. That's, you know, you do that when you're 13. Franny, you do that when you're 20. Like, you got to get past that. So by the end of the book, Salinger is going to try to convince you that the whole trick to leading a loving, truthful life is not to reject the world, but to bring that process full circle and embrace the world again. And then you care about getting an A in your English class, but you care about it in the right way. You care about who's dating who, but this time for the right reasons. And the idea is that you got to leave behind those. First, you got to throw away your rock and roll CDs because they reek of like secular ego and selfishness. But then you got to go buy them back, right? But buy them back in a different way. When he's talking about this, Franny's talking about this new way of seeing, this like Christ consciousness, he's going to call it. He doesn't mean it in like this fuzzy, weirdo, metaphysical sense, right? You don't have to be like a religious person to get on board with this. Just setting aside like whatever religious claims you may or may not want to make about Jesus, there really is no denying, right? If you read the Gospels, that this character in this book has like a really practical, loving, clear-sighted way of dealing with people, right? He looks at everybody he sees, and he just treats them with like love and respect. And he does it to the phony people in the Gospels and the genuine ones, right? The conceited Ivy League sophisticates and the full of themselves professors and the Samaritan outcasts, right? He just sort of treats them all the same. Mary, Martha, Peter, Judas, right? Pilate. The whole cast of characters, it doesn't matter, right? He's like, I'm just going to love you, and your crappiness is not going to contaminate my love, and that's the whole trick to the thing. That's the gospel in a nutshell, that Jesus embodies love without fear of being contaminated. It's infinite. How could you contaminate something infinite? And therefore it can embrace the very worst of us. That's the gospel, right? You got to love them all. It's the opposite of the Metallica album, kill them all. No, it's the opposite of that. Love them all. You got to shine your shoes. Okay, so yeah, even if we're skeptical of all this religious stuff, we can sort of see that what she's talking about is a cleansed way of looking at the world truthfully and figuring out how to love. So here's the key, right? Salinger, at the beginning of this section, called Zooey, so we've made it exactly to the end of the first section. So that's behind. I'm sorry. I didn't look at the last part that's important. But at the end of that, we learned that the narrator is the oldest living Glass brother. That's Buddy Glass, who's a writer in residence at a women's college in upstate New York. And Buddy is Salinger's alter ego. Buddy Glass stands in for the author here. And he says on page, remember on my page, I won't make you look for it, but on my page 56, he says, Buddy writes this letter, and he says, the letter itself was virtually endless in length, overwritten, teaching, repetitious, opinionated, remonstrative, condescending, embarrassing, and filled to a surfeit with affection. That's this book, right? It's just overwritten and opinionated and repetitious and just filled with affection and love. And so that he stands in for the author there. And Buddy is at pains to explain, so here's a key quote, that he says, this is not a mystical story. So on my thing, this is page 49, but yours is probably page 45 or something like that.
Is it at the beginning of
the super long paragraph? Oh, sorry.
at the beginning of the, Zoe?
It's the second, yeah,
Zoe?
it's the end of the second paragraph in the Zoe section. So find the Zoe section, find the second paragraph, it's super long, and then at the very end of that section,
Oh, yeah.
he says, he's talking about,
Bottom of 42.
he says, I think I know the difference, the very last, is it 42, Grant?
Yeah, the bottom, the
Bottom of 42. He says, I know the difference between a mystical story and a love story. I say that my current offering isn't a mystical story at all, or a religious story at all. I say it's a compound, multiple love story, pure and complicated. And so that's what we have to get about this, is that, as much as he goes on and on about the Jesus prayer, this isn't, in a sense, a traditional sense, a religious book. It's a love book. It's a love story. And that love is indeed complicated. It takes us pretty much to the end of the novel to get what he means by love. It means a love that scours the ego and deconstructs it, right? Because we just think that love is like Oprah, like self-care, be good to yourself, affirm other people. And Franny sort of withdraws from that world and finds refuge in this prayer. But here's the question that the novel is facing you with, right? Is she withdrawing from the world so that she can love the world more? Or is she withdrawing from the world because she's sick of all the phonies, herself included, swimming around trying to keep their ego chins above water by pushing everybody else's down, and so on and so on? So is she withdrawing from the world because she's trying to love it better, or is she withdrawing from it because she's like, I'm sick of all this the stupidity of the world? And that's the adolescent bit. And that's the crux of the novel, right? Whether you have a religious bone in your body or not, the point of life, that's the question it's asking, right? Is the point of life to escape the world so that you can remain pure and uncontaminated by the world's stupidity? Or is the point to love the world so deeply that it actually becomes less stupid, right? And more lovable, and you yourself become less contaminated with ego so that your human destiny is to love each other and to love the world. Zoe tells Franny, in essence, that she's got it absolutely ass backwards, right? Zoe flips on her head and says, look, you got to love all these stupid people around you first. That's the only way to love God. Don't you get it? Right? Love is not a top-down affair. It's a bottom-up business. You love the little lowly things, and only then can you see the higher things. And Franny, you're trying to get the higher things, but you don't even love this. Your mom who's bringing you chicken soup. Only once you've learned to love the chicken soup and shine your shoes can you ask those big questions like God exists, right? I'm sorry, you are not entitled, this is Zoe, right? He says, you are not entitled to have an opinion about the existence or non-existence of God. You're a teenager, right? No one has seen God. you got to learn to love your neighbor that's in front of you, and then maybe you will be entitled to have some kind of opinion about the existence of a all-consuming, self-giving love at the heart of the universe or not. But just and stop the questions, right? Just love eat the chicken soup, shine your shoes.
What,
Yeah.
around what page is the main part of that, you know?
Yes. I guess I'm sort of trying to summarize.
Yeah, okay.
What he's saying, right, is that you can't love in abstraction. You have to love the sunrise. You have to love this moment. You have to love this pain. Remember Zoe looks out the window at some point, he sees a little girl playing with her dog across the street, and he's just like, there's nice things in the world. There's nice things. We're morons, and we get sidetracked with all this stuff. And the whole key is to like enjoy looking out the window and seeing the dog. We'll end with this quotation. I think this sort of sums it up. And then we'll look at Franny and Zooey and their education a little bit on Friday. This is Dostoevsky, Fyodor Dostoevsky, sort of the great, other than Kierkegaard, the great kind of existentialist Christian of the 19th century. And Dostoevsky says this. He says, in The Brothers Karamazov, one of his characters says, love all of creation, both the whole and every grain of sand. Love every leaf, love every ray of light. Love the animals, love the plants, love each separate thing. If you love each thing, you will be able to perceive the mystery of God in all. And once you perceive this, you will grow every day to a fuller understanding of it until you come at last to love the whole world. But first you gotta love every leaf. And that girl playing with her dog across the street. So that's sort of the trick in Franny and Zooey. But how do we pull it off? We're out of time, so bring us back on Friday, I guess, and we'll try to look at the end and the fat lady and why they're freaks. Why we're all freaks when we try to do this. But we don't have a choice, because otherwise you got a choice between Lane or the Pilgrim, and that's a false choice. So Zoe wants to argue.